Hello and welcome to this first reflection for September's Bible study. This month we're going to be looking not at a particular book of the Bible but at a theme. This month we're going to be thinking about our response to violence. This ties in with September's visit to Haverhill of the Knife Angel, the National Monument Against Violence. And this gives us an opportunity to think about violence, to think about our response to it, and to think about how we as a community might come together to support and encourage one another. The reason the Knife Angel is coming, I think, to Haverhill is because we can demonstrate that we are a community that cares for one another, and that is so important when we're thinking about violence and violent crime in particular. So the passages we're going to look at for our Bible study are from the book of Lamentations, from the Gospel of Matthew, and then from the book of Acts. And in this first session, we're looking in particular at Lamentations chapter 3. Lamentations, I think, is a really interesting book of the Bible because it gives us an insight into a book that was composed in a very deliberate manner. Sometimes we're not entirely clear that that's the case for other texts in the Old Testament. They seem to have come together from different sources or grown up over time, but Lamentations is published as a book. It gets called Lamentations in the ancient languages, Trenoi in Greek or Kinot in Hebrew. Published as a collection of songs, laments, in response to the destruction of Jerusalem. So in the year 587 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon besieged Jerusalem in response to revolts led by King Zedekiah of Jerusalem, and laid siege to the city and destroyed it. That had been a period of increasing Babylonian activity in the region and direct control of the region by the Babylonian kings. And so the Babylonians came in and seized control of that whole region. And so there's a lot of texts which respond to that event throughout the Old Testament because the people were led into exile. Many people, especially those who were educated or of working class who could be put to use, were taken away into exile in Babylon. Others remained in Jerusalem, but the temple had been destroyed, the city had been destroyed. And the Jewish people had to learn again how to be culturally, religiously, socially a people, because that is what the Jewish faith had been founded on. And lots of texts respond to that. In particular, the Book of Lamentations looks like it was written in particular as a liturgical response, as something that the community could sing together as they sat in the ruins of the city. It is specifically from the point of view of those who remained in Jerusalem, and it's often said that it was authored by Jeremiah, the prophet. If you look at 2 Corinthians 25 verse 35, it says that the prophet Jeremiah raised a lament over Jerusalem. Whether or not it was actually written by Jeremiah, it certainly came out of that same situation. And if you look at the book of Jeremiah, it talks about the destruction of the city in some detail. In your Bible, you may well find Lamentations straight after Jeremiah. It interrupts those prophetic books, and so it's always been tied quite closely to the cultural environment around Jeremiah and his experience. We're going to look in particular at the third of these poems, the third chapter of Lamentations. And what's really interesting about these poems is, as I said, they are deliberately constructed in a particular art form, constructed to be memorable, constructed to be singable. If you look at each of the chapters of Lamentations as an individual poem, you'll see that most of them have 22 verses or 22 sets of verses. Lamentations 3 actually has 66, 22 times 3. And that's because each each verse or set of verses begins with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. There are 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, so they're written as acrostic poems. That helps them to be memorable, that helps them to be singable. Lamentations 3 is even cleverer. Actually, it has sets of 3 verses, and each of those will start with Aleph, 3 verses starting with Aleph, and then the next set, 3 verses starting with Bet. A wonderfully clever idea, which also helps to sort of think about the totality of the impact of the exile on the people experiencing it firsthand, and an indication that God is present in that. God, who is the God of our beginnings and the endings, he can encompass everything, all those different emotions that we feel in response to this destruction, this violent act that the people of Jeremiah's time are experiencing, and perhaps we are seeing in our midst too. So if we take a look at Lamentations 3, it begins in the first person, as if somebody is sitting there amidst the ruins of the city and looking at the destruction that has taken place. That could be Jeremiah, it could be a different author. It also sounds as if it could be the city itself speaking. And I think that's quite deliberate. I am the one who has seen affliction under the rod of God's wrath. I think that's quite deliberate, that we identify with the city, with the people of the city, because that destruction, that physical destruction, has that emotional and very physical impact on the people experiencing it. And the first 7 sets of verses, i.e. down to verse 21, go through the bitterness, the gall, the really deep emotions of what it means to experience that violence, to be the victim of violence. And look at some of these issues that are still so relevant today because of that destruction, because of that violence. We've got this physical response. Verse 16, my teeth grind on the gravel. We cower, we fear, we've forgotten what happiness is. There's that emotional darkness, that mental anguish. And then verse 19, the thought of my affliction and homelessness is wormwood and gall. And still today, think of the very practical, social dimensions to violence and the effects of violence. But by the time we get to the end of that first third of the poem, at the end of verse 21, we change the tone. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. You can see we're leading into a complete gear shift in the way that the poetry works. And then we land on verse 22, which is perhaps the heart of the entire book of Lamentations, but we have to go through that experience of pain in order to be able to acclaim with the author, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases, his mercies never come to an end. That might be a very familiar verse to you. It's used as one of the funeral sentences at the start of the funeral service, both in the traditional Book of Common Prayer and in the contemporary Common Worship. And it's a beautiful verse. And it contains a word that is at the heart of our faith, I think, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. Now that word, steadfast love, chesed, it's only one word in Hebrew. There's no word steadfast, but it's an interesting concept. It means God's faithful love to the people whom he has created. It's sometimes translated a covenantal love, a love revealed in the covenants, the promises that God makes with his people. It's sometimes translated loving kindness. There's something about kindness, there's something about favour, there's something about mercy, there's something about acknowledging that God has created us in his image, has chosen us to be his people, an idea we were thinking about in the last Bible study on the letter to the Ephesians, and therefore he shows us a particular sort of love and mercy. And that's translated steadfast love here. This mercy never comes to an end, no matter the pain of the violence and destruction that we see around us. God's mercies never come to an end. And then the author says, "The Lord is my portion, says my soul, therefore I will hope in him." Again, another interesting idea. The Lord is my portion. What we're talking about there, helek. After conquest, after a military victory, you'd often divide up the spoils of war, and you'd say, right, you get that bit and you get that bit, and that's the sort of portion we're talking about. That's what it's used for. But it also therefore becomes a sort of this is your land, this is my land. So I think here we are talking about that. Okay, God has chosen us. God has won our redemption, and that comes up later on in this book. But what does that mean for us? What do we get from that? The people of Jerusalem are looking around them and say, well, actually it doesn't look like we get any land anymore. That's been taken away from us by the king of Babylon. So what do we get? We get the Lord. The Lord remains with us. So even if we don't feel like we have any physical, material blessings, our portion, our reward, our favour is to have God with us, God's presence with us, God's love with us. Interestingly, the Levites, particular tribe of Israel who were allotted to look after the temple and its activities, they say that their portion is the Lord. The other tribes were given territorial areas over which to govern. The Levites were given a spiritual territory. Their portion is the Lord's. Now Jeremiah is looking around him saying, well, we don't have a temple anymore. We don't have land to control anymore. We all have to remember that promise, that our portion, our allotted grace is to have the presence of God with us. And then we get some further reflections on what that might mean practically. The Lord is good to those who wait for him. Sometimes we need to take time to remember and realise that spiritual benefit, that spiritual blessing. And then verse 29, it is good also to put one's mouth to the dust. There may yet be hope. Again, you can imagine somebody sitting in the ruins of Jerusalem who previously has said, God has made my teeth grind on gravel, now reinterpreting that maybe as an act of worship. To bow down and put your mouth on the ground, that's doing obeisance, that's worship, that's a worshipful pose, that's prostrating. Perhaps this is somebody reinterpreting the fact that they are a victim of violence, not to say that that violence is good, but that God can make good things come from it. And also it is good, the author says, to give one's cheek to the smiter and to be filled with insults. And that's sort of my hook that will lead us into Matthew 5 next time, to give one's cheek to the smiter. Now that word smite, again, that's an interesting word. It tends to mean making a mockery of somebody as a prelude possibly to further violence, to further insult, to further torture. And it's used that way at other times. Look at Psalm 3:8. But this act itself seems to be designed specifically to mock, to insult, to degrade. And that's where the person stops in Lamentations 3. That much, he says, might be good, what can we learn from that to humble ourselves? Remember also, God smites. He smites Egypt with the 10 plagues. That's the same word that's used in Exodus. Those are clearly a point of teaching to the Egyptians, a point that good can come out of what God does for the Egyptians, and particularly for the Israelites in that situation. But would we say that God willingly afflicts or grieves anyone? Well, Lamentations 3:33, no. That's not what God wants from this violence. God does not want violence, but he can make good come from it. The book of Lamentations goes on, verses 37 onwards. The author starts to reflect then on what this violence is about, because it doesn't look like justice is being done. And similar to other parts of the Bible, look at the book of Job. The author then builds up this argument about why God should remember his promises of mercy to the people whom he has chosen. So everything from verse 40 onwards really is the legal case for why God should show us mercy. Now again, remember, this is imaginative, this is reflective, this is devotional material designed to be sung in community, reminding the people of what good they do have, because that is so often the end result of violence, is to take away any agency that the victim has. And so in building up the legal case for God's mercy, I think the author here is trying to give agency back to the victim of violence, to take control of the situation for themselves. So he says, let us test and examine our ways and return to the Lord. Have we done anything wrong? The author says, I don't think to blame the victim. We must be very careful not to blame the victim of violence, but to say, well, how can we change this situation, take control of this situation? What could we change about how we respond to transform the situation according to love and mercy, and not according to more violence? So let us lift up our hearts as well as our hands to God in heaven. Again, a really interesting phrase, because we use it in the Eucharist. Lift up your hearts, the priest says. We lift them to the Lord. That's a reminder. Lifting up our hearts is an act of reconciliation, of contrition, of return to God, of transformation. That is at the heart of the Eucharist. And we use that phrase every time we celebrate. What else is there in this case for mercy? Jump forward to verse 57. You came near me when I called on you and said, do not fear. This is the author reminding God what he has previously said to the people. You said to the people, do not fear. You said, verse 58, you have taken up my cause, O Lord. You have redeemed my life. These are the amazing, wonderful promises that God has made to us. And the psalmist, the author, is reminding God that he's made those promises, and reminding the people that God will be faithful to those. Again, reminder, remembrance, these are Eucharistic acts. So the book of Lamentations, I think, can really encapsulate those feelings, emotions that come with violence, and help us to live into the experience of the victim and understand how we might transform the experience of the victim to take control of the situation and return agency to people when it looks like we have no control, when it looks like we have no agency, when it looks like everything has been taken away from us. And chapter 3 finishes with this plea to God to make amends, to make retribution, for the pain that has been suffered. The author isn't taking it into their own hands, but is handing that over to God. Pay them back for their deeds, O Lord, according to the work of their hands. We have no power to respond, but the author is pleading with God to do something about it. It's not always an easy read, Lamentations, and liturgically we use Lamentations at some of the most difficult times in the church year. We sing the book of Lamentations, or say the book of Lamentations, chapter 1 and 2 verses from, when we're stripping the altars on Maundy Thursday as part of our Holy Week observances. It's real moments of darkness, but that might be where we need to go when we're talking about violence. So I do hope that you take something from this and talk about it with others. And if this has raised concerns for you, please do speak to me, please do speak to others in the church, because this can raise emotional mental anxieties. But I think it's important that we acknowledge that this pain is there in the Bible, because God can encompass all that. As I started to explain at the beginning, the book of Lamentations encompasses the totality of our human experience and tries to encourage us to transform and renew that for good, according to God's promises that his loving kindness will be with us forever. Thank you for joining us for this first reflection. There's 2 more to follow, and next time we'll move into the Gospel of Matthew, looking at how these experiences are used in Jesus' own teaching, particularly this time in the Sermon on the Mount.